So it's not so hot today, but it is certainly extremely humid. So you'll forgive me if I try to keep the sweat out of my eyes occasionally. Okay. So, tangling eyebrows with the ancestors. Yeah, I've been doing that all week. So I am going to present the results of my week of tangling to you, and hopefully you will get tangled as well. The source of most of the information that I'm going to provide to you is from the Blue Cliff Record, a translation from Thomas and J.C. Clary, and it was published in 1976. And I will have more to say on that score a little bit later. So first of all, I'm going to talk about Chan and the Chan practice and how it arose in China. And then I'm going to talk about the Blue Cliff Record, which is this book that it's a piece of Chan literature that's highly revered in the Zen world. And then I'm going to talk about Yün-men, who is the fellow who is featured in today's story. And then I'm going to talk about case number 14, which is Yün-men's inappropriate statement. So that's the general outline of where we're going with this. So Chan, according to legend, Chan was founded by Bodhidharma, who is our first ancestor in China, and we say his name every day. He was an Indian meditation master, and his practice really was based in the Yogacara Sutra. But he sat for 9 years facing the wall, according to our legends. He is the 28th ancestor, counting from Makakasho. So Makakasho was Buddha's first Dharma heir, and Bodhidharma was the 28th ancestor. And he came to China sometime in the late 5th century or the early 6th century. We don't really know exactly when he got there. But he taught for over 50 years, traveling around China. He didn't start a temple. He only had 4 transmitted disciples. But he was, and there were a lot of meditation masters in China at that time, but he was one of only 2 teachers in that time period who established a continuous line of transmission. So it didn't really say who the other one was, but Bodhidharma was one of the 2 that established a continuous line of transmission. And I think that what's going to become apparent if you look into this very closely is that the transmission of the Dharma is so fragile. It's so fragile. There are so many places at which everything could have gone off the rails, and Buddhism could have died out completely. Buddhism was often suppressed in China, depending on who was the emperor. So it's important to know that. But the Dharma is very, very strong, like a spider's web. It has the strength of tensile steel. It is so strong. Spider webs are so strong. If you put them in a rope, they would be stronger than steel. So the Dharma too, even though its thread gets very thin sometimes, it's very strong. Now, both Bodhidharma and his successor, Taiso Eka, were assassinated because of their unorthodox teachings. The Buddhist establishment didn't like what they were teaching. Nevertheless, these teachings have come down to us. So Chan became one of the four major schools of Buddhism in the period from the 5th to the 7th century in China. The other schools of Buddhism were based on study of specific scriptures, like the Lotus Sutra or the Avatamsaka Sutra, or you name it. And that would be, if it was a school that was based on that sutra, that would be their major doctrine in study. So the Chan monks called those schools teaching schools. And they sometimes went to the teaching schools to learn about Buddhism before they came to study Chan. Chan was called by its practitioners and by the other monks in China the school of the patriarchs, because the practice was transmitted by a living lineage of Chan masters. It wasn't based on any particular doctrine. It advocated only the direct experience of enlightened mind. This was done to cut through all of the little tricks of the ego, to obtain liberation and see reality as it really is, to see reality directly and to know that one has no abiding self. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from the Blue Cliff record about the environment that these monks lived in. With the proliferation of Chan teaching throughout China, sincere Chan students usually made extensive journeys to call on various enlightened masters. Some continued their travels after enlightenment to deepen their experience, test their realization and that of established teachers, and familiarize themselves with methods currently in use. Aside from encounter with living examples of enlightenment, travel also was a means of learning to reduce needs to a minimum, live as efficiently as possible with nothing fixed to rely on, and become immersed in the contemplation of impermanence. In this way, Chan monks came to be called foot travelers. Emulating the ancient Buddhists as poor wayfarers and begging for their food along the way, they were also known as patch-robed monks. Now, this patch-robed monks was a term that I came across when I was editing the Denkoroku, which is the collection of the Enlightenment stories of the Zen ancestors. And I wondered about it, and this is where it originated, was in Chan practice, and the monks who traveled throughout China from temple to temple, testing the enlightened masters. So there was quite a bit of support for this practice at that time in China. There were temples all over the place. There were enlightened masters all over the place. Enlightenment was in the air that people breathed. And you'll see later that many of these masters had large groups of enlightened disciples. By the end of the Sung dynasty, which was 960 to 1279, Chan was a major form of Buddhism throughout China. Now, 1279 was the end of the Song dynasty. Dogen Zenji was in China in he came home in 1227. So he was there for, I don't remember exactly how long, but he was there in that time period during the Song dynasty. And he was one of the traveling monks that went from temple to temple, trying to get his question answered. If we're already enlightened, why do we need to practice? So the Blue Cliff Record. Okay, so the Blue Cliff Record. This is volume 1. The Blue Cliff Record was actually published in 3 volumes, and these are koans. They are cases, they're stories about monks confronting enlightened masters and what happened. Now, this was published, as I said, in 1976, and it was one of the first English translations of Chan literature. So it was very important because it's hard to believe that 50 years ago, we didn't have that much access to Buddhist literature in English. You had to learn Japanese or Chinese Mandarin to read these texts that had been passed down over hundreds of years. And this particular collection of koans is used by both Rinzai and Soto schools. There's a popular myth that Soto schools don't use koans for study, but this is untrue. Lots of Soto teachers use koans for study. And Dogen Zenji himself used a lot of koans in Shobogenzo, his most famous writing. And he also collected a bunch of them in Shobogenzo Shingi, which is a Chinese version of Shobogenzo. So this Blue Cliff Record is a living record of generations of enlightened practice. It was originally compiled by, I just have to think about this before I say it. Shito, who lived from 908 to 1052. So he was during the Song dynasty, and he was a reviver of the Yün-men school. He collected the sayings and wrote the poems that are included in this collection. So he was a master in the Yün-men school, and he was said to have had 84 enlightened successors. And later, another 100 years or so, Yuan Wu, who was a master in the Lin Qi lineage, gave the talks from which the commentary is taken that forms the bulk of the book. So there's a commentary about the story itself, and then there's a commentary about Shito's poem, and that's that. And then there are other little snarky remarks that Yuan Wu makes about various things. So he makes notes about some of the things that happen. Now, all the Rinzai schools in Japan descended from Yuan Wu. So he's the guy that made the commentary in the Blue Cliff Record, and all the Rinzai schools in Japan descended from him. He had 75 enlightened disciples. Dogen Zenji, when he went to China, discovered this text shortly before he was due to leave China. And he was so impressed with it that he spent the whole last night that he was in China hand copying this text so he could take it back to Japan. The original printing blocks were burned in 1148 by Tao Wei because he felt like koans were being misused, that they were just being looked at for their poetry, etc. And so he burned the printing blocks. The version of that we have today is based on an edition of 1300 that was based on two previously published versions and the remaining handwritten copies. So just think about this. This was during the time when Western civilization was experiencing the Dark Ages and was just beginning to get the first glimmers of the Renaissance. And here was China and the Chan practicers experiencing this explosion of Chan literature and collections of sayings of the Chan masters, and this very rich environment in which they could go from place to place and be oh gosh, what's the word I want? Induced into enlightenment, perhaps, yeah. And sometimes that came at the end of a staff. So, Yün-men. That Yün-men was Wei Yen of Yün-men. Yün-men was actually the name of the mountain that he taught at. So that's where his monastery was. That's where his temple was. So his actual name was Wen Yen. He founded the Yün-men school of southern China, which took its name from Yün-men, the mountain, which means gate of the clouds. The Roaring Stream, which is another collection of stories about Zen masters, calls him the last great genius of Chan. He had 60 enlightened disciples. And this school, his Yün-men school, preserved and transmitted a lot of the Chan literature that we have today. So they were dedicated to preserving these texts for the future. This school lasted for about 300 years before it was absorbed into the Lin-Chi lineage, which became the Rinzai lineage in Japan. This monastery still exists today, although the lineage has died out, and it's probably run by the Chinese government. Most of the Buddhist temples in China are. Yün-men was noted for his wondrous and often impenetrable sayings. His creativity and originality were legendary. He offered one-word answers, answered questions he had asked himself. He made up new answers for old stories, and he answered some questions with mime. He told his disciples that they should not record his sayings, but they made paper robes and recorded his sayings surreptitiously on their paper robes. So he actually ended up having quite a large record of what he said and did. Yün-men was among the first Chan masters to make extensive use of stories and sayings of old masters in his teaching. And these cases gradually replaced the study of the scriptures, and they began to be used as objects of concentration and contemplation in order to induce enlightenment. So the method that they used was concentration without thinking, and they called this contemplation. It was a way of allowing the phrase or word to reside in the mind without thinking about it, to just be sitting there and just focusing on that without thinking about it. So this was the way that koan study was done in this era of Chan. The effort of the student is always an essential ingredient. So the explanation of these things, of these koans, is minimal. Nobody tells you what the answer is. You're supposed to figure it out for yourself. Now, in later times, books of koan solutions arose, but I wouldn't trust that. Somebody else's idea of what the answer is seems a little not helpful. So here we are at case number 14 of the Blue Cliff record, which I quoted in my little introduction in the digest for the talk. So the 14th case is titled Yün-men's Appropriate Statement. A monk asked Yün-men, "What are the teachings of a whole lifetime?" Yün-men said, "An appropriate statement." So Yuan Wu's comment on an appropriate statement is an iron hammerhead with no handle hole. And his commentary goes like this. Members of the Chan family, if you want to know the meaning of Buddha nature, you must observe times and seasons, causes and conditions. This is called the special transmission outside the written teachings, the soul transmission of the mind seal, directly pointing to the human mind for the perception of nature and the realization of Buddhahood. For 49 years, old Shakyamuni stayed in the world. At 360 assemblies, he expounded the sudden and the gradual, the temporary and the true. These are what is called the teachings of a whole lifetime. So all of the Buddha's teachings that he gave during his lifetime. So it's not our lifetime, it's the Buddha's lifetime. The monk in this case picked this out to ask, what are the teachings of a whole lifetime? Why didn't Yün-men explain for him in full detail, but instead said to him, an appropriate statement? As usual, within one sentence of Yün-men, 3 sentences are bound to be present. These are called the sentence that encloses heaven and earth, the sentence that follows the waves, and the sentence that cuts off the myriad streams. He lets go and gathers up. He's naturally extraordinary, like cutting nails or shearing through iron. He makes people unable to comprehend him or figure him out. The whole great treasure house of the teachings comes down to just 3 words, an appropriate statement. There is no facet or aspect in which you can rationalize this. People often misunderstand and say Buddha's preaching was appropriate to the conditions of one time. Or they say the multitude of appearances and myriad forms are all the impression of a single truth. And then there are those who say it's just talking about that one truth. What connection is there? Not only do they not understand, they also enter hell as fast as an arrow flies. They are far from knowing that the meaning of that man of old is not like this. Therefore, it is said, shattering one's bones and crushing one's body is still not sufficient recompense. When a single phrase is understood, you transcend 10 billion. So if you can solve one koan, that's as good as solving 10 billion. Undeniably extraordinary. What are the teachings of a whole lifetime? Just about boils down to his saying an appropriate statement. If you can grasp this immediately, then you can return home and sit in peace. So that is his commentary on the story. And the iron hammerhead with no handle hole is explained by the translators as the idea is that you cannot make a hole in the hammerhead with rationality. You've got the iron hammerhead with no hole. What are you going to do now? So he says later in his commentary on the poem, this monk, in this case, the one who asked the question, was also an adept, and that is why he could question like this. And Yün-men too answered this way, much like wedging a stake into the iron hammerhead with no hole. So these guys were talking in a different language at a different level from ordinary language. And this is often the case. You'll find in koans or in Zen stories, they're just so paradoxical, and it's because they take place on a different level. These are enlightened people talking to each other, and they have a different perspective on the world. That's why it makes it difficult for us ordinary people to understand. When Yün-men says, an appropriate statement, what's it like? It's like breaking off one of the black dragon's horns. Now, dragons with horns are delusions. At this point, if there were no such thing, how could he have spoken as he did? So I have found in looking around on the internet and in various places that this particular story, what Yün-men said is often translated as an appropriate response. Now that's very different from an appropriate statement. And I like to think that the Clarice got this right, because in Yuan Wu's commentary, he talks about the statements that other people have made in response to this case. And he says, no, that's not it. So I'm thinking perhaps that an appropriate statement is the correct translation. And that's just my opinion, of course. I have no translation experience. So what to do about this? I'm not going to give you an answer to this case. I'm not going to tell you what I've discovered about it. And you shouldn't tell me what you've discovered about it. It's something that we need to take into our meditation and contemplate. Use our concentration to unlock this puzzle if it can be unlocked. A monk asked Yün-men, what are the teachings of a whole lifetime? Yün-men said, an appropriate statement. At Shasta Abbey, they had a translation of Fukan Zazenge, which is instructions for Zazen, that we chanted every afternoon during the Ango, which lasts for 10 weeks. And this is the way it goes. This part of it. The ancestors were very diligent, and there is no reason why we people of the current day cannot understand. All you have to do is cease from erudition, stop thinking, withdraw within, and reflect upon yourself. Should you be able to cast off body and mind naturally, the Buddha mind will immediately manifest itself. If you want to find it quickly, you must start at once. So there is no reason that we people of the present day cannot understand. There is no reason why we people of the present day cannot become enlightened practitioners. All we have to do is put in the work. And that's the important thing. What is an appropriate statement? So we're going very late today because of our long ceremony. So I think I will not entertain questions or comments today. So thank you very much.